So, we made it! The last day of 2023. Another year has come and gone, and yeah, this year has yet again not taken the world in that much of a promising direction, to say the least. And at this point, it's getting concerning how common this has been in recent years. And honestly, I just want to see that change for once. Whoa, okay, off to a weird start, sorry about that. But if I am to say one positive thing about 2023, there was quite the variety of movies we got throughout the year. There were plenty of long-awaited releases that everyone was hyped for this year, like Nimona, Five Nights at Freddy's, and Mario. And I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, but I even had a good time with that Barbie movie. And all that was just a mere slice of the cinema cake this year. But if nothing else, the movie that just about everyone was looking forward to was the big one we all heard of by now. While it didn't have as long of a wait time as some of the other movies this year like Mario or FNAF, where the concepts of those movies were hinted at long ago, this movie still had quite a wait to it, and even a delay, which I'll get into later. So yeah, this movie grabbed the attention of a lot of people. And understandably so, given the impression that was left by the first movie, Into the Spider-Verse. But before going into all that, I feel there's enough substance here to go into some history and see how this Marvel from Marvel got from where to he is now. The concept of Spider-Man goes back as far as 1962, brought to us by the late Stan Lee and his teammates Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. Although the Spider-Man story was intended as just a single issue at the time, they may not have seen it coming, but Spider-Man would end up becoming one of the most, if not the most iconic character in the Marvel legacy. So, with the success of this character, they gave him his own comic series starting in the following year, 1963. And that success would end up spanning for decades, and is still enjoyed through new releases to this day. For a while, the franchise would mostly have Peter Parker as the main focus, being the one and only Spider-Man. But thankfully, that wasn't the case permanently. Alongside these comics, as time went on, Spider-Man would end up getting generations of different shows and movies. And some of these passing generations would invite new artists and writers who would at some point get inspired to create whole new versions of Spider-Man. One of the biggest examples would end up being Miles Morales, who was given life back in 2011, created by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pichelli. And like with Peter and some of the new Spider-Man versions, he would get his own focus in different varieties, be it appearances in comics, movies, or TV shows. But then at one point, Miles would be given a spotlight far bigger than ever, with the release of the movie Into the Spider-Verse in December 2018. And ever since then, Miles has been getting a huge spike of recognition and love from the fans. I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but when the first movie was still brand new, I wasn't that much into it. I know it may sound surprising, but it took quite a bit of time before I started warming up to it. Although keep in mind, we're talking about me from 5 years ago, before Nunny and Isness was even a thing. I can happily say I've matured a lot since then. I've learned to have a more open mind over the years, and see appreciation in a lot of things, especially with movies like this. Now, of course, the sequel was the movie that came out this year, and that movie was gonna be the main focus for this video at first, but I figured I'd cover both movies while we're on the topic to help keep production a little more organized. And naturally, we're starting with the first movie for the sake of sequential order. So, like I said, I wasn't that much of a fan of the first movie when it was still brand new, and while I can't pin it on just one reason, I can think of one or two that probably explains it. As around the time of the first movie, I've sort of been straying away from Marvel stuff. I mean, the last of the Marvel stuff I saw up to that point was the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies, which back then, and even looking back on it, I never had that much of an interest in. And this kind of reaction made me feel like I was starting to drift away from Marvel in general. But then this movie came out, and I figured I might as well check it out. From a distance, it seemed like nothing more than just a mere experiment. Like some kind of new Marvel product with a new generation and new style. But then again, it was also getting a lot of hype during that time, which made it seem like it would have been worth a watch even more. And yeah, even the first time watching, I was greatly invested in the visuals. And there were a few jokes I felt were delivered really well, however, this also led to a few side effects for the first time watching. Being so drawn into these smaller details first time around, I was surprisingly having a really hard time following the story. With so many different characters and elements being thrown in all at once, it could understandably a bit more of a challenge to keep focused when there are a ton of details you have to remember, especially from the first time watching. And the time I spent away from Marvel stuff back then, obviously didn't help either. Thankfully, I managed to get the DVD sometime later to rewatch and try to pick up on some details I missed, and I am so glad I did that, as it did quite a service for me to help change my outlook since then. Cause had I started writing the script with that same blind and negative outlook from back then, I can already tell I'd end up falling down a rabbit hole of my own like some kind of garden variety lolcat. To say this movie was a nice surprise would be quite an understatement. I'd go as far as to say it was a saving grace for Sony. It was like a well-needed breath of fresh air when you look back at some of the other movies they were giving us at the time, especially after... yeah. Alright, so I'm gonna try my best to summarize the movie for the newcomers here, but heads up, there's gonna be a lot to unpack. But I'm sure you'll be able to follow, and of course there's gonna be a lot of spoilers coming, so moving forward will be up to you. So this movie's mostly about Miles and his progression arc about becoming the new Spider-Man, after he was bitten by that typical radioactive spider. And around that same time, the original Peter was taken down by Kingpin, which definitely puts a lot more weight on Miles in this situation. During all his effort, he ends up meeting a bunch of other Spider-Man based heroes from other dimensions, consisting of an alternate Peter, Spider-Noir, Penny Parker, Peter Porker, and Gwen Stacy. Through his interactions with them, as well as through different experiences he faces after getting these new powers, Miles starts to gradually, but still progressively learn what it takes to become his own Spider-Man. Now, I may not know what thoughts were going through the minds of the crew as they were putting this together. Maybe they just went with their guts and decided to fly with their basics and go by what they were simply capable of. Or they were extremely confident and assumed this was going to be the next big thing. But whatever the case may have been, it seemed like it was the best course of action, and in more ways than one. They wanted to give the world a newer version of Spider-Man, so it would have been smart to make this first installment as impressive as possible to get everyone's attention. And by golly, they made it in the end. I may not have felt this at the start, but now I can definitely see it after the last few watches. Having all these characters thrown into the story and how they did it made for a great impact. With all these different Spider-Man heroes they gave us in the movie, there's no doubt that a huge purpose of this was to serve as a love letter to the longtime fans of the franchise. The writers definitely had them in mind while helping to put this together. And sure, there are some who may still be a bit of a newcomer with the franchise, but if that's the case, this movie can serve as a nice way to help them start learning. While it may not be completely accurate with some characters, it might still offer enough to help them find someone to grow an attachment to, and probably try to learn more about them. As I'm sure many of us have done with at least one character in just about any franchise at some point in our lives. A lot of these characters were given an appropriate amount of time with the other heroes to develop their own interactions and pairings among each other, with probably the biggest pairing from these heroes coming between Miles and Gwen. In fact, this ended up getting so big, they had to use a good portion of the next movie to give a better example of how far they can go together. And while on the topic of characters, there was plenty to unfold on the villain side too. Unlike in a lot of previous Spider-Man movies, which tried to give more focus on the most recognizable villains possible, they thought outside the box and went the other way, both by creating their own designs for said recognizable villains, and giving more of a spotlight to some of the more forgettable villains, like Kingpin for example. Although whether or not we can say he really is the obsolete type, that mostly depends on your experience with the franchise up to that point. As for me, I knew he existed as I remember seeing him in different forms. Like I remember him from the books, vaguely. But I have a better memory seeing what he was like in the original show and even the PS4 game. But here, they had a much newer spin on him. In this movie, they still keep him as roots by making him a fierce crime lord, but they also give him a bit more depth too. He may still have that sinister side to him, but he also has a family side to him too. He shows to be a caring husband and father. In fact, that was the whole reason why he was doing all this in the first place. All in an attempt to bring back his family. Though I feel the story would have been a little better had they given him more of a reason why he hated Spider-Man, as that was the sole reason why his family left him to begin with. I guess it's because Spider-Man foiled another one of his plans? Which I suppose would be the most common guess. But considering everything else Kingpin had going for him, I was kinda expecting there to be a bit more to his story from there. But really, it's not that much of a problem. What we got anyway was still a pretty nice outcome. We still get to see him in all his thick, menacing, and super strong glory, just with a more exaggerated design, but still a design that helped give him more of a memorable impression. Aside from him, there were a handful of other villains who made smaller appearances, like Tombstone, Scorpion, and even Green Goblin. And even still, there were a few other villains that were given different routes in the story, with the most emotional being with the Prowler. And that was due to the reveal of him being Aaron, Miles' uncle, and that he was done in just a few scenes later. Of course, since this is a Spider-Man story, we need to have someone close to the hero taken away, so that was to be expected. But man, they still know how to get you to feel it sometimes. Though I do wonder if anyone else was taking notice of his Prowler costume when they saw his body, and where that went from there. Well, actually, that kinda goes into the next movie, so we can touch on that later. And there was one more big villain that I'm still a little confused by, but I'd say came out pretty great with what we were given. And that one happened to be Olivia, also known as Doc Ock. I'll admit she was really cool looking, but she didn't really seem to have much of a goal herself outside of working alongside Kingpin. Which on its own would be perfectly fine if they didn't go as hard as they did to develop Kingpin with his family story. And all the screen time and impact Olivia had made it seem like there was going to be more to her in some ways, but that's never really shown. Maybe if they gave her a similar writing treatment, like if she had a secret of her own, maybe she was trying to save someone she cared about, or maybe if they gave her more of a reason as to why she was helping Kingpin in the first place, this kind of stuff would have helped given her some depth too. And that would have probably helped her leave a lot more of an impression. And yeah, we got a few things from her in that regard. It was slightly implied she had some history with Aunt May, and I guess it would be fair to assume working on the Large Collider made her power hungry, but they never seemed to go that far with those details. Although that's not to say she had nothing going for her. Mind you, there were quite a few details she had that I'd say were handled pretty well. Her entrance alone made for some decent foreshadowing, as there were like one or two scenes she was in that made it seem like she wasn't going to be evil to begin with, or at least she would have been easier to deal with before they actually meet her. This gives off the impression she might not be that bad, then we cut to when they actually meet her, and POW! That's where she unleashes her twist. And again, she was one of the biggest driving forces that helped Kingpin get as far as he did, which essentially helped expand the whole plot itself, so that was a definite plus, and she helped arrange some pretty satisfying and quite intense fight scenes. So I'd say she deserves a lot of credit for that, if nothing else. And as I said earlier, the animation was another huge plus for the movie. But I'm gonna have to let this out since I've had the misfortune to see this rumor being spread around, so I'm gonna have to say it. No. This was not animated by AI. I may not be the biggest expert on the movie, but I've seen enough to know there were in fact people with their own rightful jobs involved. And most, if not all these people have even scoffed at the AI field themselves. Though yeah, there are different styles being merged together, which is usually seen as a common running trait through AI, but there's more to the production than that. A simple look at the behind the scenes footage and some outside research can confirm there was a whole crew adding their own animation skills to this, which means they ended up getting more of a say on how things went, and it helped boost their careers to get this done. But then again, that did lead to a bit of a problem in the next movie, but I'll go more into that later. So in the end, this movie gave us a style that was very unique and did a great job displaying the comic book theme they were trying to go for. You can definitely tell there was a lot more soul, care, and attention to detail given to this thing, especially a lot more than anything those ridiculous machines could ever give us. And all the effort certainly paid off in the end. Heck, this kind of style has already started serving as inspiration for the few years it's been around. As I mentioned in my Puss in Boots review, The Last Wish was a huge example. You can definitely see some significance when you look at these two films back to back. It gave a very nice touch to both of them, and I'm hoping we get to see more of this kind of teamwork and style added in later works in a more positive light. And again, there were plenty of jokes in the story that worked well too. And looking back on these, I am kinda shocked I never got sold on most of these the first time around. Honestly, there was only like one scene that got a laugh out of me through my first view, and it was the restaurant scene. Yeah, the fact that their disguises took a little effort may have been kind of predictable, but the outcome being that they still worked given the atmosphere, that was actually kinda charming. And Peter's reaction to seeing MJ and having a slight meltdown over her, that worked well in multiple ways. Like he couldn't tell it was him under the mask, and he remembering her from the dimension made it more clever as she was lacking context. There were plenty of details I did and still do like from that scene. And now more recently, I was finding humor in more bits like this. And as a result, I have more of an understanding on what makes them work. One of my new favorite jokes was the classic stairs scene around the beginning. Miles spun our expectations around by passing on his first web-swinging test on the roof. Unlike a lot of other generations where they'd go for it first try, be it for himself and or for cinematic purpose, while Miles decided to not go for something so extreme right away. That was more unexpected, but still a pretty understandable reaction, and that made the setup really clever. The last one I'd like to bring up is in Peter's memorial scene. Now, I might be thinking a little too hard about this, but the way I saw it during my last viewing, I started to feel something from it. how Miles was getting the idea MJ's words were kinda directed at him, as he was partially responsible for Peter's death, and yet those around him don't realize that. It's witty bits like these that can help a scene feel a bit more natural, while at the same time they can also help stop a scene from getting too grim. I'm not sure if that was intentional, but I feel it shows that sometimes there can be one or two small bright details to what can feel like the darkest of moments, and that can come off as a very positive outlook, and can also be important to think about for a lot of us in these recent years. So in conclusion, for those of you who've been following me through the shark fins back in 2018 or 2019, yeah, the movie may not have held my interest as much back then, but I'm still glad I watched it when it was in theaters. It gave me the drive to get the DVD and notice so many different details and elements upon later watches, all leading us to where we are now, with me finally letting this all out after so long. But even though I've been finding more satisfaction in this movie as the years went on, I still wouldn't say it's a goldmine of perfection. I mean, that kind of goal would be impossible for any movie, and this is not an exception. Like, there are a few other smaller issues I'd say I might have, like the song they may use to portray an emotional scene may feel a little out of place, or in the big climax when Miles is remembering everything all the other heroes said to him. Yeah, I could definitely feel a passion in that scene, but it still feels a little unnecessary because we just heard him say these same lines just a few minutes ago, so it doesn't really feel as effective as it could have been. But despite all that, this was still a pretty big accomplishment for what it did. It helped break the mold that Marvel's been usually going by lately, gave us something new that both old fans and new viewers can enjoy, and it gave us an era that a lot of people can think about and enjoy, and later wonder what's to come from it, which would leave all their thoughts floating about in the air for the many years to come. Hold it! The first movie left a pretty big silver lining for Marvel, and even Sony. And to top it off, it got a lot of satisfaction from the public media. So of course, there was bound to be a sequel on the way. And that sequel was given the title, Across the Spider-Verse. But there were some rather unfortunate situations that were going on during production, to the point where the movie's release had to be pushed back an extra year. And now, after 5 years, we stand here at the end of 2023 and finally having seen the magic come back in all its glory. One of the biggest additions we got from this movie is that they used a hefty portion of its runtime to help give more of a story to Gwen, as we get to see what's been happening on her end during her time away from Miles. And even when she does reunite with him, she still gets a good portion of the story, which is a pretty nice touch, as Miles and Gwen seem like great equals in the first movie, and that movie was focusing on Miles, so it would have been a good idea to give her as much focus to help flesh her out too, just to balance it out. And so they followed through with it, and they gave a pretty satisfying outcome. However, what I wasn't expecting was the surprising controversy that was arisen with her dad, George Stacy. But it's probably fair to assume he was most likely working long enough on the force, to the point where his job had taken over most of his mind that he didn't really know what to do when he found out about Gwen. And even still, he does try to make a more positive change about that around the end. But regardless, it feels like it might be a little too soon to say where he goes from there. As for me, I feel there was a nice rebound between Gwen and George in that scene, and I do hope they go somewhere with this in the next movie, preferably somewhere a bit more positive. This movie also brings in a new villain for the story, the Spot, who I'm going to assume most of us didn't know about beforehand, but there's still a chance some are familiar with him as he made a few scattered appearances in some of the older shows, and even got his own feature in Marvel Future Fight. But aside from that, I can't imagine many would have known about him walking into the theater for this movie. But regardless of if you didn't know about him, or if you did but you didn't know he was gonna be there, he still made for a nice surprise villain in some regard. The designers knew how to take his simple black and white color scheme and give it a lot of creativity. His portal ability also helps him fit in with the movie, as it builds off of the different dimensions that we were learning about in the first movie. And his setup was the foundation that helped him work for this kind of story. According to his original lore, he used to be a normal scientist named Jonathan, who used to work for Kingpin, which is also all they showed him in the movie, but here they made some changes to his story so it would make a better fit for the movie. And what they came up with was actually pretty clever. Back then, Jonathan was just a background character who you've probably forgotten about from the first movie, and now they turned him into a big new threat for this movie. As a side note, he was voiced by Jason Schwartzman, who a lot of Scott Pilgrim fans might know as the actor for Gideon. His performance in this movie alone can be interesting enough as he's got a decent balance between goofy moments and then followed up by coming off as a huge threat. Although I should say there is one thing I feel could have made the spot a little more interesting. Considering he had a connection with Kingpin, I feel there should have been a scene added where Miles and or Gwen go to find Kingpin in the prison he was sent to, and then they could probably try to interrogate him for some info on the spot, and hopefully they could have learned more about him through that. Mind you, I'm not trying to say the movie was ruined by this being left out. Not at all. This was mostly just a me thing, as I feel this kind of scene could have made a nice opportunity. They could have used it to reveal more potentially interesting details on these forms of the characters, and we could have learned some things about what Kingpin knew about Jonathan before he turned into Spot, and we could have even seen Kingpin himself after everything he went through in the first movie, and how all that could have affected him after all this time. But still, the movie did really well, even without this kind of scene. But with the third movie on the horizon, there's still a small chance we might get a scene like that after all. Who knows? On the side, we got to see the return of, some of the Spider people. Like, Peter comes back, and he's got a daughter now, May Parker, who, as some of you may know, also originated from an older generation, but now we get to see her at some of the earliest points in her life. It's nice they decided to give her a bit of a spotlight in this movie, and it leaves a slight possibility that this will be the first sign of her getting more movie appearances. Well, maybe not in this era, but it could still lead to something. And if nothing else, this shows how much Peter's grown since the first movie. This alone gives him a big sign of character evolution from when we last saw him. I'd have to say, because of this, Peter definitely went through the biggest change out of the group. And not only that, we also get to see the return of Penny, slightly, and there's barely a sign of Porker or Spider-Noir until like the very end, which I'll admit is a bit of a shame. I certainly miss Noir, and I was kinda hoping we'd get a bit more intake from him again. But there's still hope we'll get to hear more of that iconic Nicolas Cage voice in the next movie. And even if we don't, at least we'll get to see more of these new main heroes from the Elite Society to help fill the time. Some of you may remember these heroes, some of the more biggest examples being Jessica Drew, or Pavitor Brabakar, or Hobie Brown, or even Margot Cass. All of which, you guessed it, were actual characters introduced in various generations of the Spider-Man franchise. And now they have their own unique spin on their original designs made for this movie, to which I'm sure we'll get to see more of in action once the third movie rolls around. And of course, one of the biggest factors, or probably the biggest factor that just about everyone got from this movie, is what's known as the canon event. A factor that's been heavily protected by Miguel. It was essentially the element that helped set up the entire second half of the movie, as well as set up the story for the next movie. From what I gathered, it's supposed to be that one thing that helps set a person's fate in stone to become their own Spider-Man-based hero, particularly by losing someone close to them. This, of course, is one of the most common factors in the franchise. I'm sure we're all familiar with it by this point, as just about every, if not every generation and version of Spider-Man has gone through this in some form. For pretty much everyone involved, this serves as a boost for that iconic line, "With great power comes great responsibility," as it works as morality for all these heroes that practically anyone could end up meeting the same fate as this one person close to them if they're not careful. And with this in mind, even when it's being put in more of a spotlight now, it helps show more growth in the other side characters that may not have been noticeable in the first movie. And don't get me wrong, I liked her in the first movie, but for most of what we've seen from her back then, on the surface level, it was likely a lot of people would have assumed that most of her charm was coming from the fact that she just had a sunny personality and a cute face. But this movie implies that she too had to encounter this kind of fate, as she lost her dad from her dimension, being Peter. And you can definitely see the effect it had on her from her appearance in this movie. That grim look on her face was pretty unexpected after the impression she gave us for most of the first movie. But this does help show another side to her character, and show this can truly be as serious as it seems. And the same can be said for pretty much anyone else we see here in the Spider-Verse. That all these spider people may seem fun and colorful, but they all practically share the same deep dark kind of backstory. And after thinking of all this, it does raise the question, who's really in the wrong here? Miguel or Miles? From where it stands, it looks like the next movie could take this concept either way. Considering the overly aggressive impression that Miguel left us, it could leave some to wonder. Were his actions all for naught? Could there be a loophole to this concept? Or was he right this whole time and trying to save Miles? Well, it looked like we were close to finding out the true solution to all this, and we could have found out where the writers were planning to go with this, until... Yeah, I am not even joking. This was left off with a cliffhanger. Like I said earlier, There were some production issues along the way. A majority of them happened to center around the unfortunate working conditions for some of the members behind the movie. In fact, that was part of the reason why this movie was tacked with a cliffhanger in the first place. Well, that and also because this movie was already long enough with what they already had finished, but also because they were desperately short on time when they came to this decision. While the movie itself was still a wild ride, it's a shame to imagine what the team's been through that whole time. And I really hope the strikes and everything the studio went through serves as a wake-up call for them. And hopefully those in charge learn some things from these issues during this production. As much as I really want to see where the story goes from here, I hope everyone involved gets the proper pay, time, and respect they deserve for this. And so this brings us to where we are now. At the moment, not much has been said about the next movie, aside from the revealed title to be Beyond the Spider-Verse. As it stands, this movie could end up going in many different directions. Miles could probably learn from his mistakes and learn how to fix everything, or it could be somewhat possible there's one slight detail that could potentially fix everything that Miguel might have overlooked, or never even noticed before. And yeah, that may not be as likely or reassuring, but there's still a chance they could make something powerful from it if they do end up going that route. And it still doesn't stop there. There are plenty of other paths and endings they could take the story that could lead to a satisfying conclusion to everything. Or at least a conclusion that hopefully won't lead to a massive pileup, but we won't get to know until much later down the road. Maybe this next movie will go through a smoother production with better treatment for the staff behind it, or maybe this movie will lead to a very worthwhile conclusion, and maybe Marvel and Sony will learn some things looking back on the trilogy when it's all done, and maybe other studios will learn some things too after everything they went through during those strikes. And maybe this will be the start toward positive changes that'll help many lives go to better paths for the future. And maybe 2024 will lead to a more tolerable year for once in general. Whew, that was a lot of maybes. But like I tend to say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we? Happy New Year everyone, and let's all hope for a more decent and tolerable year for 2024.